Step into the time machine. Let's travel through the past. Mystic Ball's gonna take you on a history blast. From ancient civilizations to the world wars. Get ready, hold tight.
Hey guys, in this video I am going to give a broad overview of the Vietnam War, the causes of the war, its relation to the Cold War, and how it affects U.S. history. So to start with, Vietnam, the country, was controlled by the French in the 1800s due to the French imperialism, and eventually during World War II it's going to be controlled by the Japanese. When Japan loses the war, they have to give up their territories in China, Korea, and Vietnam. And so when the French see that this territory is available once again, they try to resume their control over Vietnam. Unfortunately for the French, the Vietnamese revolt and they fight for independence under leader Ho Chi Minh. And this is right after the Korean War conflict. So they saw that Korea revolted and they got independence, and now Vietnam is going for independence. And eventually the French troops surrender because they're surrounded by the North Vietnamese, and the entire country of Vietnam becomes independent of French control. An interesting fact, it was Vietnam, the country, we used to be known as French Indochina before they gained their independence. During the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam is separated into two separate countries: the North Vietnamese, who are controlled by communist leader Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnamese, who are non-communist, and they're controlled by Ngo Dinh Diem. Here's the global map. Vietnam is this orangish country where my mouse is. So you can see, in relation to the United States and in relation to France, they're not very close neighbors. They're pretty much as far as you can get neighbors from France to the west and the United States to the east. So it really doesn't make sense to the Vietnamese people to have control set all the way in Europe or in later on in the United States. So they're not going to be very open to that type of situation. Here's a close-up view. So you can see their neighbors are Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, China, and then the Pacific Ocean to the east. So Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, was Catholic by religion, and he's very authoritarian. So that means he's not going to be open to votes or opinions from people at the civilian level. And because he's very authoritarian, a lot of the Buddhists begin to protest his rule because Vietnam is primarily Buddhist. The French bring in Catholicism. So here in these pictures you can see the Buddhist monk protest where they're setting themselves on fire in protest of Diem's rule. And eventually Diem is going to be assassinated by his own leaders because he's not a good ruler. They don't like having him. So after Diem is assassinated, the U.S. begins to step up their role in policing Vietnam and making sure that it doesn't become full communist, because Diem, although he was a terrible authoritarian leader, he at least had the same ideology as the U.S. in terms of politics and economics. As the U.S. begins to ramp up their policing of Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurs where two U.S. ships were patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin, and they reported that they'd been fired upon by Vietnamese boats, which, if you remember World War II, our boats got fired upon at Pearl Harbor. U.S. enters the war. World War I, our boats get fired upon. U.S. enters the war. So you start to see this pattern. The interesting part about this one is the reports that come out after the fact say that the U.S. doesn't have evidence that the boats were fired upon. Usually if you get fired upon, there's like bullet holes and damage, but only one of the boats had sustained any fire damage, so one boat was not fired upon. Even though this is the case, the U.S. escalates its troop deployment, and the president asks Congress to give him full authority to do whatever is needed to resolve the conflict with the North Vietnamese. In 1965, 3,500 Marines were sent to protect the U.S. air base in South Vietnam at the beginning of 65. By the end of 65, 184,000 U.S. troops are sent to Vietnam. So in 1 year, 180,000 additional troops are sent. By 1968, 500,000 troops are in Vietnam. And here's a graph that shows the troop escalation. It goes from like this line that you can barely see all the way up to this huge blue line. So when the troops are in Vietnam in late 65, 66, the Vietnamese are using guerrilla tactics to fight, such as ambushes, booby traps, sneak attacks, tunnel systems where you can hide in the tunnel, jump out, attack, run back into the tunnels. There's a lot of interesting traps where they would have like a poisonous snake in a backpack. So if the soldiers were searching through the backpack, the snake would be really hungry and it would jump out and bite the soldiers. Different pits with spikes in them, things like that. So if you want to do some additional research, go Google Vietnamese war traps. They're pretty scary looking. So the tactics used by the U.S., on the other hand, they did carpet bombing campaigns. Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. dropped 864,000 tons of bombs. Search and destroy missions where soldiers would search villages and tunnels and destroy whoever they found. Destroying the supply lines of the Vietnamese. And you're trying to use napalm, which is like a liquid jellied gasoline that catches fire and burns down the trees, so it forces the Vietnamese soldiers out into the open. Also Agent Orange, it's an herbicide that kills the jungle, so that way the soldiers are forced out into the open. The unfortunate thing about these tactics is there was a lot of friendly fire with the napalm and with the Agent Orange. Based on where the wind is blowing, the Agent Orange can get into water that the U.S. troops were drinking, get into the lungs, cause birth defects, spinal bifida, cancer, skin deformations, all these different effects of the Agent Orange. So very dangerous tool, probably not the smartest thing to spray into the air, but at that time they thought that was the best they could do. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war for the U.S. This was during the Vietnamese New Year celebration called Tet, where the U.S. troops had sort of let their guard down, and also the South Vietnamese had let their guard down to celebrate the New Year. While this was happening, the North Vietnamese attacked hundreds of Vietnamese cities and U.S. defenses. During the surprise attack, the U.S. embassy was broken into in Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, and it was really a black eye for the U.S. because all of this was captured on TV and news media. It made the U.S. look incompetent, and it showed that even with 500,000 troops, they couldn't defend their positions effectively. Becomes a turning point for many people in the home front, where they begin to see the war as unwinnable and not worthwhile. So college students begin to oppose the war and protest at this time. They start with peaceful protests that later become violent. The anti-war movement gets its legs at this time. There's occupation of college buildings, chanting defiant slogans, kids tearing their draft cards up and boycotting going to the war. And we really start to see the emergence of the new left at this point in the 1960s. Students for a Democratic Society is formed, free speech movement is formed, and they really begin to criticize the big business, the government establishment, the war effort, and just all around a distrust of authority occurs during this time among the young students and the young Americans. 1970, President Richard Nixon tries to negotiate an end to the war. He tries to give the whole war over to South Vietnam so they could continue it on their own. Even though he talks about ending the war, He's secretly bombing Cambodia during this time to try to get Vietnamese leaders who've escaped Vietnam into Cambodia. And also during this time, the My Lai massacre occurs, where U.S. troops are witnessed killing around 500 civilians, and also some gang rape occurs at this My Lai massacre. And the word gets back to the U.S. that this is going on, and it really shuts down the war in terms of public opinion, where it becomes more than half the population want the U.S. to withdraw, and Nixon is forced to eventually withdraw the troops by 1975. So the legacy of the war, not a very good legacy. Not much was accomplished from the U.S. Citizens and taxpayers' perspective. 58,000 Americans are killed. Over 2 million North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese die in the war. The returning veterans face hostility at home. A lot of the young people who were against the war begin to express displeasure towards the veterans who return. 15% of the veterans approximately develop PTSD. Nearly 58,000 soldiers commit suicide due to this PTSD, due to the addictions that they developed, and due to the mental health issues that stem from the war. So nearly the same amount of troops that died in battle died from later of deaths of despair and suicide. So not a good feeling to be the returning soldier and have all these mental issues, but not a lot of help and not a lot of positive treatment when you come back. So those are the legacies of the war. Later on, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which bans the president from sending troops overseas for more than 48 hours without permission from Congress. So now a president can't send troops for more than 2 days unless more than 50% of Congress approves. He can also veto Congress's rejection of the war, and then Congress can override the president's veto with 2/3 majority. So as long as Congress has 2/3 majority for or against a war, they can tell the president what to do with the troops. They can either say withdraw the troops or keep the troops there. But that's a very valuable power of Congress, because now we can't have these 20-year wars that go on without the Americans' approval, just because there'll be pressure on the congressmen to act one way or another. So those are the legacies of Vietnam. It changed how we declare war. One interesting development from the Vietnam War is the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and the papers showed that the U.S. government never had a thought-out plan of how to win the war, and it made it seem like the draft was unnecessary. So this whole situation creates a distrust of government when it comes to war and when it comes to having a draft. Unfortunately, we haven't had a draft since then, and the presidents have had more accountability when declaring war. So those are the political legacies. And here's a picture of the memorial that's in D.C. for all the fallen soldiers from the Vietnam War, and you can see people still lay flowers, and it's pretty artistic how the war memorial is reflective. So if you go to look at it, you see the names, but you also see the viewer's face in it like a mirror. So it's like it shows that we're all tied to the war, and we all have a role to play in preventing war. So there's the legacy. I hope this video was helpful to you guys, and if you have any further questions about Vietnam, feel free to reach out.
Let's travel through the past. Mr. Gold's gonna take you on a history blast from